Picture this for a moment. The sun breaks over a misty field in ancient Europe, and there they stand, 10,000 men moving as one. Each Roman soldier, clad in iron and leather, knows his place in a living machine of war. The sound of their marching feet strikes the earth like a drumbeat of destiny. Shields lock, swords gleam, and in the eerie quiet before the storm, you can feel the weight of history holding its breath. This was not just an army. It was a masterpiece of human engineering, a symphony of discipline and design that conquered the known world. How did they do it? What made the Roman legions so devastatingly effective, century after century, against every enemy they faced? The secret did not lie in brute strength alone, nor in individual heroics. It was something far more profound, something almost mathematical in its beauty. It was the battle formation. From the flexible checkerboard of the triple line to the impenetrable testudo, or tortoise, formation. The legions employed tactics so advanced that they feel modern even today. They turned chaos into order, fear into control, and battle into a calculated art. And here's what's truly astonishing. Many of these formations weren't just about winning battles. They were about dominating the psychological landscape of war, shaping not only how a fight unfolded, but how it was perceived, both by the enemy and by the soldiers themselves. In this video, we aren't just studying history. We're stepping onto that field. We're going to break down exactly how these legendary formations worked, why they were so revolutionary, and what they can teach us about organization, leadership, and human ingenuity under pressure. You'll come away not only with a deeper appreciation for Roman military genius, but perhaps with a new way of seeing challenges in your own life, because some forms of order are timeless. So, if you've ever wondered how a relatively small city-state rose to rule an empire, or what it truly took to stand in the front line of history, you're in the right place. Let's march back through time and decode the legion's most powerful secret, their battle formations. To understand these legendary formations, we first need to meet the men who made them possible, and the machine they served within. The Roman legion was far more than just a group of soldiers. It was a complex, hierarchical organization, a society in arms built on a foundation of unparalleled discipline and rigorous standardization. At its heart was the legionary himself. This was not a conscripted farmer handed a spear. He was a professional soldier, a volunteer who signed on for 25 years of service, and his entire life was dedicated to the art of war. His training was brutal and continuous. Recruits were taught to march over 20 Roman miles in 5 hours while carrying a pack that could weigh upwards of 60 pounds, building not just stamina, but the muscle memory to move in unison with thousands of others. They practiced with wooden swords against heavy posts, drilling strike and parry maneuvers until their arms ached, all to ensure that when they faced a living enemy, their reactions would be automatic. But perhaps most crucially, they were drilled relentlessly in formation changes. They learned to shift from a marching column to a fighting line, and into complex tactical arrangements, like the triple acies without a second thought, responding to trumpet calls and standard signals without hesitation. This wasn't just practice, it was programming. The goal was to make discipline and obedience more powerful than the instinct of fear. This discipline was enforced by the centurion, the backbone of the legion. These were not aristocrats but career soldiers, often risen from the ranks, who commanded a century of roughly 80 men. You could spot a centurion by his transverse crest helmet and the vitis, the vinewood staff he carried not as a walking stick, but as a tool for discipline. He was a father figure and a brutal taskmaster, responsible for the training, morale, and performance of his men. His voice had to cut through the chaos of battle, and his example was everything. When the line wavered, it was the centurion who stood firm. His authority was absolute, and his presence was the glue that held each small unit together, making the century the essential building block of every larger formation. And then there was the equipment. Every legionary was a master of tools designed for both individual combat and collective unity. His most iconic piece of kit was the scutum, a large, curved rectangular shield made of laminated wood and leather, with a heavy iron boss at its center. This wasn't just for protection. It was an offensive weapon for bashing and an integral component of the wall that formed the testudo. His primary weapon was the gladius, a short, double-edged sword perfect for the thrusting and stabbing motions required in tight formation fighting. He also carried two peeler, heavy javelins with a soft iron shank, designed to bend on impact, making them impossible to pull out and throw back, and often rendering an enemy's shield useless. From his helmet to his hobnailed sandals, every item was mass-produced to precise specifications, ensuring that any soldier could replace any piece of gear, and more importantly, that every man would move, fight, and defend exactly like the man beside him. This unwavering standardization is what allowed 10,000 individuals to function as a single, terrifying entity on the battlefield. Before the legions became the unstoppable machine we envision, the Roman army looked very different, and its first major evolution was born not from ambition, but from a humiliating defeat. In its earliest days, Rome's forces mirrored those of the Greek city-states it admired. They fought in a phalanx. This was a dense, tightly packed block of heavily armored infantrymen, each carrying a large round shield and a long thrusting spear called a haster. The phalanx was a powerful, almost unstoppable force when it was moving forward on open, flat ground. Its strength was its collective mass. It was like a human battering ram. But it had one critical, massive weakness. It was utterly inflexible. It required perfectly flat terrain to operate effectively. The moment the ground became uneven, or the battle moved into hills and forests, the tightly knit formation would break apart, creating gaps and leaving its soldiers vulnerable. This fatal flaw was exposed in the most brutal way possible during the Samnite Wars in the 4th century B.C., when Roman armies marched into the central Apennine mountains. The Samnites were not a conventional enemy who would meet the phalanx head-on in a noble field battle. They were rugged Highlanders who mastered the art of guerrilla warfare. They used the rough, broken terrain to their advantage, launching ambushes from the hills and forests, attacking the Roman flanks and rear where the phalanx was most vulnerable. In the cramped valleys and steep slopes, the Romans found their magnificent formation was more of a death trap than an advantage. They were bogged down, surrounded, and utterly defeated. The most infamous of these disasters was the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 B.C., when an entire Roman army was forced to surrender in humiliation, symbolically passing under a yoke of spears as a mark of their subjugation. This catastrophic loss forced a moment of profound military introspection. The Romans were pragmatists above all else. They recognized that to survive and ultimately conquer the varied landscapes of Italy, they needed to abandon the rigid Greek model and invent something entirely new, something built for adaptability. The result was the manipular legion, a system so revolutionary it would become the bedrock of Roman military power for centuries. The key innovation was breaking that single, monolithic phalanx block into smaller, independent units called maniples, which translates to handfuls. This was the birth of modular warfare. An army was no longer one giant fist. It was now composed of many smaller, interchangeable units that could operate semi-independently, like fingers that could grasp, punch, or defend as the situation demanded. The legion was now organized into 3 distinct lines based on age, experience, and equipment, creating a depth that was both tactical and psychological. The youngest and poorest soldiers, the Haestoti, formed the front line. Behind them came the principals, men in the prime of their life and veterans of several campaigns, providing steady resolve. The rear was held by the triarii, the true veterans' battle, hardened, grizzled old soldiers who were the last and best hope if a battle turned desperate. It was said that when things were going badly, a Roman would cry, "It has come to the triarii," meaning the situation was dire. Each of these lines was further subdivided into maniples of about 120 men, and each maniple was separated by a gap equivalent to its own frontage. From above, the formation would have looked like a checkerboard. This revolutionary checkerboard pattern is what gave the manipular legion its incredible flexibility. Those gaps between the maniples were not weaknesses. They were the entire point. They allowed for a level of maneuverability the phalanx could never achieve. Fresh maniples from the rear lines could move forward through the gaps to relieve tired troops in the front. Wounded or breaking units could fall back through those same channels to regroup without collapsing the entire formation. Most importantly, it allowed the legion to absorb and channel an enemy's charge. An attacking force wouldn't hit a solid wall. They would push into these gaps, only to find themselves hit on their flanks by the maniples to their left and right, who would then pivot to envelop them. The Romans had turned a rigid, forward-moving formation into a dynamic, multi-directional combat system that could fight on any terrain, against any foe. This willingness to learn from a shattering defeat, to adapt and innovate, was the true beginning of Rome's path to empire. So how did this revolutionary checkerboard of maniples actually function in the heat of combat? The answer lies in the army's standard deployment, known as the triple acies, or the triple line. This was not a single wall of men, but a deep, layered system of defense and attack, designed to absorb pressure and maintain a constant, fresh front line against the enemy. Imagine looking down on the legion as it formed for battle. You wouldn't see one solid block, but rather 3 distinct lines, each made of maniples with deliberate gaps between them. This created a formation with both depth and flexibility, a stark contrast to the brittle, single-line phalanx of old. The front line was held by the Haestoti. These were the youngest men, often in their late teens or early 20s, and while they were the least experienced, they were by no means cannon fodder. They were the first test, the initial shock troops. Their job was to absorb the enemy's initial charge and break its momentum. They were armed with 2 pila, those heavy javelins, which they would hurl at close range just before impact. The design of the pilum was fiendish. Its long iron shank would bend on impact, either weighing down an enemy's shield so he had to discard it, or piercing through it entirely, often wounding the man behind it. After throwing their pila, the Haestoti would draw their gladius swords and close with the enemy, fighting in the brutal, intimate chaos of the front rank. Theirs was a position of immense pressure, and they weren't expected to win the battle alone, but to wear the enemy down. Directly behind them, separated by the width of a maniple, stood the second line, the princeps. These were older, more experienced soldiers in their prime, perhaps in their late 20s or 30s. They were the backbone of the legion, the decisive force. While the Haestoti were engaged, the princeps would stand ready, watching the fight unfold. If the Haestoti began to tire or falter, they wouldn't simply be left to die. Instead, the maniples of the princeps could step forward through the gaps in the first line, seamlessly relieving the exhausted Haestoti, who could then fall back through those same channels to catch their breath. This system of rotating lines was a psychological masterstroke. It meant a soldier in the front knew he wasn't doomed, relief was possible, which gave him the courage to stand and fight longer. And for the enemy it was a nightmare. Just when they thought they were beginning to overpower the first line, a new, fresh, and even more experienced wall of soldiers would appear, their shields locking into place, their swords ready for the kill. The enemy's fatigue was met with Roman freshness. And then there was the third line, the triarii. These were the true veterans, the old guard, men who had survived decades of campaigning. They were fewer in number and often armed more traditionally, sometimes even with the long haster spear, a nod to the old phalanx days. Their role was not to be part of the standard rotation. The triarii were the ultimate reserve, the last line of defense. They would typically remain kneeling behind their large shields, conserving their energy and staying out of the missile fire, until they were absolutely needed. A Roman saying, ad triarios reducer, meaning, it has come to the triarii, was the equivalent of saying things had reached a desperate, last stand moment. If the Hastoti and Principes were forced back, they would retreat through the gaps in the triarii's line, who would then stand, level their spears, and form a solid, unbreakable wall to cover the army's reorganization, or, if necessary, its orderly withdrawal. Their very presence was a safety net, an assurance to the entire army that all was not lost even if the front lines wavered. This three-layered system turned the entire legion into a breathing, living entity that could withstand shock, replace its own losses, and constantly present a renewed face to an enemy who had only one chance, one wave of energy. It was a masterpiece of sustained combat. This iconic checkerboard arrangement, known as the quincunx, was the brilliant geometric mind of the legion made visible on the battlefield. At first glance, to an untrained enemy eye, those gaps between the maniples might have looked like vulnerabilities tempting channels to push through and break the Roman line. But that was the ultimate tactical deception. Those gaps were not weaknesses. They were calculated killing zones, pre-planned avenues for maneuver that gave the legion a fluidity no other ancient army could match. Think of it not as a static line of soldiers, but as a dynamic grid. Each maniple operated almost like an independent combat unit, a tile on a chessboard that could be moved to support its neighbors. The true genius of this system revealed itself the moment an enemy, like the Gallic tribes or the Macedonian phalanx, took the bait and charged directly into one of those inviting gaps. They would quickly find themselves in a nightmare of their own making. Instead of bursting through the Roman line and causing a rout, they would push into a corridor that was flanked on both sides by fully formed Roman maniples. These enemy troops, now channeled into a narrow space, would have their own formation compressed and disrupted, their flanks completely exposed. This was the moment the legion's drill and discipline paid off. On a signal, the maniples to the left and right of the gap would perform a simple but devastating maneuver. They would pivot inward. In a matter of moments, the enemy soldiers who thought they were exploiting a break suddenly found themselves caught in a three-sided trap, assaulted from the front by the maniple they had initially charged, and from both sides by the pivoting units. They were enveloped, surrounded on three sides, and cut down in a crossfire of gladius thrusts. The gap they had charged into became their tomb, but the quincunx was just as vital for the Romans' own movement and morale. Those channels allowed for the continuous rotation of fresh troops that we discussed earlier. A tired unit of Hastoti from the front line didn't have to fight to the death. They could execute an orderly retreat backwards through the gaps in the Principes' line behind them. Simultaneously, the fresh Principes could advance forward through those same channels to take their place at the front, their shields locking into a new, unbroken wall. This movement could happen seamlessly, without any panic or disruption to the overall formation. For the Roman soldier, this system was a profound psychological advantage. He knew he wasn't abandoned on the front line. There was a clear, rehearsed system for relief, which gave him the courage to stand his ground longer. For the enemy, it must have been utterly demoralizing. Just as they were beginning to wear down the first line of defenders, that line would seemingly dissolve, only to be instantly replaced by a new wall of rested, determined soldiers. It was like trying to fight a hydra. For every head you tired yourself out against, 2 fresh ones appeared. The quincunx didn't just win battles through force. It won them through a relentless, grinding efficiency that broke the enemy's will. But for all its offensive brilliance, the manipular system was designed for open field combat. When the battle moved to the walls of a city or a fortified position, the Romans needed a different kind of formation, one designed not for maneuver, but for absolute, impenetrable defense. This was the testudo, or tortoise formation, perhaps the most iconic and visually stunning tactical innovation in military history. Imagine a unit of soldiers transforming themselves into a single, living, moving fortress, shielded from the deadly rain of enemy arrows, spears, and stones. This was the ultimate expression of Roman discipline and collective unity, where the individual completely vanished for the protection of the whole. The process of forming the testudo was a meticulously drilled ballet of synchronized movement. On command, the men in the center of the formation would raise their large, curved scutum shields directly over their heads, holding them flat and horizontal. These shields would overlap like the scales of a fish or the tiles on a roof, creating a solid, continuous roof of wood and leather above their heads. Meanwhile, the soldiers on the flanks of the unit did not raise their shields overhead. Instead, they turned them perpendicular to the formation, holding them at the sides to create solid walls, protecting the group from attacks coming in from the left and right. The men in the very front row, of course, kept their shields facing forward, defending against any direct assault. The result was a box, a protected cube of men, utterly shielded from every direction. From the perspective of an enemy defender on a wall, it must have been a terrifying and frustrating sight. A slow, methodical, and seemingly invulnerable monster inching its way toward them. The primary purpose of the testudo was siege warfare. Its most famous application was during assaults on fortified cities or camps, where defenders would rely on plunging fire from walls and towers to break an attack before it reached their gates. A testudo could advance across open ground toward a city wall, its roof deflecting a constant hail of arrows, javelins, and even heavy stones dropped from the battlements. This allowed the Romans to safely bring up battering rams to smash gates, or scale ladders to the walls, without being decimated by projectile fire. The historian Josephus, describing the Roman siege of Jerusalem, noted that the testudos were so effective that Jewish defenders resorted to pouring boiling oil down onto the shields in a desperate attempt to break the formation, knowing that conventional missiles were useless. The formation was also used in open battle on rare occasions, most notably by Mark Antony's troops during his retreat from Parthia, where it provided crucial protection against the Parthians' infamous horse archers. Yet, for all its legendary strength, the testudo was not an invincible superweapon. It had significant and well-known vulnerabilities that a clever enemy could exploit. The first was its crippling lack of speed and mobility. Locked tightly together, each man's movement constrained by the shields around him, the formation could only move at a slow, deliberate pace. This made it a sitting duck for artillery, like the heavy bolt-throwing ballistae or stone-hurling catapults that could punch through the shield roof with terrifying force. A direct hit from one of these engines could not only kill several men, but also cause a catastrophic break in the formation, leaving the survivors exposed. The formation was also extremely vulnerable to a sudden, concentrated cavalry charge, or an infantry assault from the flanks or rear. If the side shields wavered for even a moment, or if the enemy could get around behind the slow-moving box, they could easily break into the formation, and the tightly packed soldiers inside would have no room to effectively defend themselves with their swords. Furthermore, the testudo was utterly useless on uneven or broken ground. A single stumbling soldier could create a gap that would ripple through the entire structure, causing it to collapse at the worst possible moment. It was a specialized tool for a specific job, a masterpiece of defensive engineering that exemplified the Roman principle of solving a military problem not just with courage, but with impeccable organization and a shield. While the testudo was the ultimate shield, the legion also possessed a devastating hammer, the quincunx, or wedge formation. This was the opposite of a defensive posture. It was a concentrated, aggressive spearhead designed for one purpose only: to smash through the enemy's line and tear it apart from the inside. Imagine the psychological impact of seeing this shape emerge from the Roman ranks. A sharp, angled wedge of shields and swords pointed directly at you, moving with relentless purpose. It wasn't just a charge, it was a calculated act of demolition. The structure of the wedge was a masterpiece of applied force. The name quincunx literally means wedge in Latin, and its design was as simple as it was brutal. The formation was built like a human arrowhead, with a single veteran soldier at the very tip, the point of impact. Flanking him on either side were 2 more men, and behind them 3, and so on, with the formation widening row by row. But the key was the personnel. The men chosen for the very front, especially the tip, were not raw recruits. They were the most experienced, battle-hardened soldiers in the century or cohort, often led by their centurion. These were men who possessed not only superior skill with the gladius and scutum, but also the iron nerve to lead the way into what seemed like certain death. Their job was to absorb the initial, brutal shock of impact and not falter. The physics of the wedge are what made it so effective. Instead of a broad frontage where force is distributed evenly, the quincunx concentrated the entire weight and momentum of the attacking unit onto one incredibly small point. Think of trying to push a plank of wood through a wall; it would splinter. But take that same force and apply it through a metal spike, and it punches right through. That was the principle at work. The tip of the wedge would smash into the enemy line, and the relentless pressure from the rows behind would simply drive it deeper, using their shields to physically force the enemy apart. The goal was to create a rupture, a tear in the enemy's formation. Once that initial breach was achieved, the real chaos began. The wedge wasn't designed to stop, it was designed to penetrate. As the front ranks forced their way in, the following rows would surge forward into the gap, widening it and pushing the enemy soldiers to the sides. This would have a catastrophic effect on the enemy's cohesion. Men would be separated from their comrades, their lines would splinter, and their command structure would break down as officers were isolated. From a unified fighting force, they would devolve into a confused mass of individuals, desperately trying to defend themselves from attacks coming from all directions. The panic was infectious. Seeing a group of their own men being consumed by this Roman machine from the inside would often trigger a rout, as the will to fight evaporated faster than the line itself could collapse. The wedge was a high-risk, high-reward tactic. It required immense courage and trust from every soldier involved. The men on the flanks of the wedge knew their sides were exposed, and they had to have absolute faith that the men behind them would protect them. But when it worked, it could decide a battle in a matter of minutes, transforming a static clash of lines into a rout. It was the legion's surgical tool, its armored fist, deployed at the critical moment to deliver a knockout blow. It demonstrated that Roman tactical genius wasn't just about defense and discipline. It was also about unleashing controlled, overwhelming violence with mathematical precision. But for all its aggressive power and disciplined defense, even the mighty Roman legion could find itself in a situation where all tactics had failed, where maneuver was impossible, and survival was the only remaining objective. This was the moment for the orbis, or the orb, a formation of pure, desperate last resort. Picture a cohort, or perhaps even an entire legion, completely surrounded by an overwhelming enemy force. The flexible checkerboard is useless. There are no flanks to turn, no gaps to exploit. The testudo is impractical, as attacks threaten from every direction at once. In this moment of ultimate peril, the Romans would fall back on their most primal, instinctive defensive shape, the circle. The command to form the orbis would have sent a chill through even the most veteran soldier, for it signaled that the initiative had been completely lost. This was not a formation for winning a battle. It was a formation for choosing how to die. On the order, the soldiers would rapidly contract inward, their training overriding their panic. The outermost ring of men would lock their large scutum shields together, edge to edge, creating a continuous, chest-high wall, facing outward in all directions. Their gladius swords would be held ready between the shields, presenting a bristling hedge of steel to any enemy who dared approach. Behind them, the ranks would compact tightly, each subsequent ring raising their shields overhead to form a partial roof against incoming arrows and javelins. In the center, the wounded, the standards, and the highest-ranking officers would be placed, protecting the heart and soul of the unit for as long as possible. The psychological impact of the orbis was profound. For the Romans inside, it transformed sheer terror into a semblance of order. The chaotic nightmare of being surrounded was replaced by a clear, familiar structure. Every man had a place and a duty, to hold his segment of that fragile wall. This shared purpose forged a powerful bond of defiance. They were no longer a scattered mob, but a single organism under siege, drawing strength from their last shred of discipline. For the enemies surrounding them, the sight was equally powerful. The chaotic rout they expected had not materialized. Instead, they were faced with a silent, spiked fortress of shields and determined men. It was a clear message: you may kill us, but you will not break us. The orbis was the ultimate expression of the Roman military ethos, that even in certain defeat, discipline and unity would prevail over chaos. History provides us with stark examples of the orbis in action. Moments frozen in time that testify to its grim purpose. The most famous account comes from Julius Caesar's own commentaries on the Gallic Wars. During his campaign in Britain in 54 B.C., a small force of his 7th Legion was isolated and surrounded by a massive host of Britons while foraging for grain. With no hope of immediate relief and facing annihilation, the centurions barked the order to form the orbis. This disciplined circle allowed them to hold out for hours against relentless attacks, buying precious time until Caesar himself could arrive with the main force and rescue them. Without that formation, they would have been slaughtered to a man within minutes. Yet for every story of miraculous rescue, there were undoubtedly countless more that ended in tragedy. The orbis was a delaying tactic, not a solution. Its weaknesses were as apparent as its strengths. It was a static target, vulnerable to hunger, thirst, and fatigue. A determined enemy could simply wait them out, or continually probe the circle for a weak spot. If the shield wall buckled at even one point, the entire formation would collapse like a pierced blister, and the end would be swift and brutal. The orbis, therefore, stands as the most poignant symbol of the Roman legionaries' world. It showcased the absolute extreme of their training and ethos, a belief that even when victory was impossible, there was still a correct, honorable, and orderly way to stand together and face the end. While the orbis represented a final, desperate stand, the legions also perfected a highly specialized formation designed to counter one of the ancient world's most terrifying battlefield weapons, the cavalry charge. Charging horsemen, with their immense mass and momentum, could shatter infantry lines and turn an orderly battle into a slaughterhouse of panicked men. To meet this threat, the Romans developed a brutally effective defensive tactic, a formation that transformed a vulnerable line of soldiers into a static, razor-sharp fortress specifically engineered to kill horses and break the spirit of their riders. This formation didn't have a single iconic name like the testudo, but its function was clear. It was a repel cavalry formation. When the shout went up warning of approaching enemy horse, perhaps signaled by the distant thunder of hooves and a rising cloud of dust, the Roman response was immediate and drilled to perfection. The first two lines, the Haestoti and Principes, would not form a solid wall. Instead, they would create a dense, bristling barrier. The front rank would drop to one knee, anchoring the butts of their heavy pilar javelins firmly into the soil, angling the sharp iron points outward and upward at about chest height to a horse. This created a lethal, improvised spear wall. Right behind them, the second rank would stand, their own pier held overhand, ready to thrust or throw at close range. All the while, every soldier's large scutum shield was interlocked with his neighbors, forming a continuous, almost seamless barrier from the ground up. The resulting sight was a deceptively still, silent, and horrifying obstacle. A shield wall topped with a deadly thicket of iron points. The psychological warfare at play here was immense. A cavalry charge relies on two things: impact and terror. The goal is to hit a line of infantry so hard and so fast that it breaks before contact, allowing the horsemen to ride down fleeing soldiers with ease. But the Roman formation removed both of those advantages. There was no obvious weak point, no gap to exploit, no sign of panic to encourage the charge. Instead, the cavalryman was faced with a deliberate, silent, and utterly murderous wall. His horse, a creature of instinct, would see the wall of shields and the glint of metal, and would often instinctively refuse to plunge into such an obvious death trap at the very last second, shying away or rearing up. This would break the momentum of the charge and throw the entire attacking formation into disarray. If the horse did not stop, the results were ghastly. The animal would impale itself on the waiting pilar, the weight of its own charge driving the spear deep into its body. The rider would then be thrown violently to the ground, directly at the feet of the waiting Roman infantry, who would swiftly finish him with their gladius swords. This tactic was a masterpiece of using an enemy's greatest strength against them. The Romans understood that the power of a cavalry charge was not just in the swords of the riders, but in the sheer kinetic energy of a 1,000-pound animal moving at high speed. Their formation was designed to accept that energy and redirect it catastrophically back onto the attacker. It turned the horse itself into a projectile of its own demise. Historical accounts, such as those from battles against the Parthians, renowned for their heavily armored cataphracts, or the various Celtic tribes with their noble warrior elites on horseback, show the effectiveness of this disciplined response. It was a stark lesson that against Roman discipline, raw bravery and shock value were often not enough. The repel cavalry formation was a cold, calculated, and brutally efficient solution to a battlefield problem, proving once again that the legion's greatest weapon was not the sword or the spear, but the unbreakable will of the men who held them in perfect unison. Before the heavy infantry of the Haestoti, ever felt the shock of combat. The battlefield was already alive with a different kind of warfare. A deadly dance of speed, harassment, and chaos, performed by the legion's youngest and most agile soldiers, the velites. These skirmishers were the army's forward screen, its eyes and its sting. Operating in a fluid, open order formation that was the complete opposite of the rigid maniples behind them. Their job was not to stand and fight, but to move, provoke, and disrupt, using the terrain and their own mobility as weapons to soften the enemy before the main event even began. Drawn from the poorest and youngest citizens in the legion, typically in their late teens, the velites were the definition of light infantry. They wore no heavy armor that might slow them down, often just a simple helmet, and sometimes a small, round shield called a palma for minimal protection. Their primary weapon was a bundle of light javelins, each about 3 feet long and tipped with a narrow iron point designed to bend on impact, ensuring it couldn't be thrown back. This light kit was their greatest asset, allowing them to run, dart, and weave across the front of the Roman line with a freedom the heavily laden Hestoti could only dream of. They were the swarm before the hammer blow. As the armies deployed, the velites would flood the no-man's land between the two forming lines. They didn't operate in a neat, organized rank. They spread out in a loose, open-order skirmish line, using every dip in the ground, every patch of scrub, every bit of cover to their advantage. Their mission was twofold. First, to act as a reconnaissance screen, identifying the enemy's composition, spotting any hidden troops or unusual deployments, and relaying that information back. Second, and more critically, they were there to harass and weaken. They would run forward in small groups, hurl their javelins at the enemy formation, and then immediately scatter and retreat before any effective countercharge could be launched. This constant buzzing attack was designed to inflict early casualties, but more importantly, to frustrate and unnerve the opposing force. A volley of javelins raining down from skirmishers you couldn't quite catch would fray nerves, break concentration, and could even disrupt the careful dressing of an enemy's battle line right before the main advance. The most brilliant aspect of their entire operation, however, was not the attack itself, but the retreat. The velites' entire tactical existence relied on the manipular system's genius. After they had exhausted their javelins, or when the enemy heavy infantry began its serious advance, the velites needed to get out of the way, and fast. A disorganized route back through the main Roman lines would have been disastrous, causing panic and breaking the formation before the fight even started. But the Romans had already engineered the perfect solution: the gaps in the quincunx. The velites would stream back towards the Roman lines not as a terrified mob, but in controlled groups, funneling themselves directly into those pre-planned channels between the maniples of Hestoti. This was a drilled and rehearsed maneuver. The heavy infantry would hold their positions, shields locked, creating safe, protected corridors for the light troops to pass through. The velites would rush through these gaps, and once safely in the rear, they could regroup, resupply with more javelins, and prepare to provide support elsewhere. This seamless integration meant the Roman army could transition from a scattered skirmish to a solid battle line without a single moment of vulnerability or confusion. The enemy, advancing with increasing momentum, would suddenly find the annoying skirmishers gone, only to be faced with the silent, ominous, and perfectly ordered wall of Roman heavy infantry that had been waiting there all along. Yet for all their brilliance on the battlefield, the legions spent the overwhelming majority of their existence not fighting, but marching. The true test of Roman military engineering wasn't just how they fought, but how they moved, and no formation was more critical to their operational success than the agmen, the marching column. An army's ability to travel vast distances quickly, safely, and in good order was often more decisive than any tactical maneuver. And the Romans elevated the simple act of walking into a precise logistical science. The standard agmen was a breathtaking sight, a snake of thousands of men, animals, and wagons stretching for miles, yet moving with a disciplined rhythm that allowed it to cover 20 Roman miles or more in a single 5-hour march, day after day. This was no disorganized mob on the move. The structure of the column was meticulously planned for both speed and security. At the very front rode the vanguard, the explorators. These were mounted scouts, often auxiliary cavalry, whose job was to range miles ahead of the main force, searching for ambush sites, surveying the best routes, and identifying river crossings. Behind them came the army's spearhead, a light infantry unit, perhaps a cohort of auxiliaries, ready to deploy quickly and secure any narrow pass or wooded area before the bulk of the army arrived. Following them was the heart of the agmen, the legions themselves, marching in a long, winding column, each maniple or cohort moving as a distinct unit. Interspersed throughout were the mule trains, carrying the army's essentials, the tents, the milling equipment, the entrenching tools, and the 16 days' worth of rations each soldier was expected to carry. At the very rear came the baggage train proper, the long and vulnerable line of wagons carrying the siege engines, the commander's personal effects, and the army's treasury, protected by a strong rear guard of infantry. This entire procession was a monument to Roman foresight, a moving city that carried everything it needed to build, feed, and defend itself wherever it went. However, this long, linear column, while efficient for rapid movement, was a potential death trap in hostile territory. Its immense length made its flanks terribly vulnerable, and it could take a dangerously long time for the entire army to deploy from a line of march into a proper battle line if attacked from the side. For this exact scenario, the Romans had a brilliant counter formation, the agmen quadratum, or the hollow square. When scouts reported signs of an enemy presence, or when the terrain, like a dense forest or a narrow valley, screamed of ambush, the entire army would transform itself. The maneuver to form the agmen quadratum was a complex, pre-drilled ballet of movement. The vanguard would halt, and the units behind would quickly wheel to form the front line of the square. The legions marching in the center would split, half moving left and half moving right, to form the long sides of the rectangle. The rearguard would then advance to close the formation, creating the fourth and final wall. Inside this protective box of shields and spears would be all the army's most vulnerable elements: the baggage train, the mules, the engineers, and the high command. The resulting formation was a mobile fortress. It could continue its march, albeit at a much slower pace, while being protected from attack on all four sides. Any enemy ambush party emerging from the woods would not find a long, exposed flank to attack. They would find themselves staring at a solid, prepared battle line, already facing them, with javelins ready to fly. The agmen quadratum eliminated the element of surprise and turned a potential catastrophe into a manageable, defensive engagement, allowing the army to fight its way through to safety without ever breaking its orderly progression. It was the ultimate expression of the Roman military mind, expecting threat in every shadow and having a pre-rehearsed, disciplined solution for it. Now let's pull back from the front lines and climb the small hill where the true architect of this living machine observes the chaos below. The Roman general did not lead from the front with a heroic charge. His role was that of a master conductor, positioned on a commanding vantage point to oversee the entire symphony of destruction. From this elevated perch, the battle was not a blur of individual fights, but a dynamic, flowing map. His job was to read that map in real time, to see the subtle shifts in the enemy's disposition, the points of pressure in his own lines, and the fleeting opportunities that could decide the entire engagement. He couldn't shout orders that would be lost in the din. His control over the vast army was exerted through an intricate and brilliantly efficient system of communication. His primary tools were sound and sight. The air above the legion was filled with the distinctive calls of the unison, the horn players attached to each century and cohort. These were not simple noisemakers. They were instruments of precise command. Each unit had its own hornist, and different sequences of notes conveyed specific, pre-drilled orders that every soldier recognized instinctively. A short, sharp blast might signal a century to halt, while a rising series of notes could command a maniple to wheel left. The general's instructions would be relayed to his staff, who would then signal the appropriate hornists, and within moments, a specific block of 80 men would pivot, advance, or retreat in perfect unison, all without a single word being spoken from the general's mouth. This system allowed for localized, granular control of the battlefield's many moving parts, but for larger strategic shifts, the general relied on his signal flags and the legion's sacred standards. The most important standard was the aquila, the eagle, the soul of the legion. But almost as crucial were the signa, the tall poles topped with emblems and medallions that marked each century and cohort. From his position, the general could see these standards across the field. His own signalers, standing beside him with large, brightly colored flags, would send messages to the standard bearers of the major units. A specific pattern of flag movements might order the entire right flank to advance, or the triarii in the rear to prepare to move forward. The standard bearers, seeing the signal, would then tilt their signa in the commanded direction. To the soldiers on the ground, their entire world had narrowed to the man in front of them and the standard of their century. Where that standard went, they followed. It was a chain of visual command that could redirect the entire army's effort without a single runner having to brave the battlefield. And yet, for the most complex and nuanced orders, runners were essential. These were not mere messengers. They were trusted, athletic officers who knew the army's layout by heart. They would sprint from the command post down into the fray, darting through the gaps between maniples to deliver sealed tablets or specific verbal commands directly to the centurions and tribunes leading the front-line cohorts. This was the most dangerous method, but sometimes it was the only way to convey a detailed plan, like ordering a specific cohort to feign a retreat to draw the enemy into a trap. The general had to constantly weigh the necessity of the message against the very real risk that the runner would be killed before delivering it. A reminder that even with flags and horns, the fog of war was ever present. The true test of a general's skill was his ability to process this constant flood of information, watching the ebb and flow of the lines, listening to the reports from scouts and runners, interpreting the signals from distant units, and then make a decisive move. He might see the enemy concentrating their best warriors against his left flank. His response: order the hastati on the left to hold firm, while signaling the principes on the right to push their attack harder, forcing the enemy to divert resources and relieve the pressure. Or he might spot a weak point in the enemy's formation, a thin spot in their line where a sudden, concentrated wedge attack could punch through. He would dispatch a runner to the centurion of a nearby cohort with the order to form quincunx and strike immediately. This was high-stakes chess played with human lives, where a single well-timed command could unravel the enemy's entire strategy and turn the tide of history. This complex system of communication turned the theoretical brilliance of Roman formations into a living, breathing reality on the ground. It was the legion's true nervous system, a network of instant commands that allowed the general's will to be felt by every single soldier simultaneously, cutting through the deafening roar of combat. Imagine the scene, the air thick with the screams of men, the clash of iron on wood, the thunder of thousands of feet, a cacophony where no shouted order could possibly be heard. Yet, amidst this chaos, a sequence of clear, resonant notes from a horn would rise above the din, and instantly, an entire century would pivot on its heel to face a new threat. This was the power of the cornu, the long, curled G-shaped horn carried by the cornison. Each musician was attached to a specific century or cohort, and the calls were not generic alerts but precise, pre-drilled commands. A specific series of notes might mean form testudo, while another signaled advance at double time, and another retreat in good order. Every legionary, from the rawest recruit to the grizzled triarii, had these signals drilled into him until they became second nature, a language more immediate and powerful than words. But sound alone could be lost in the wind or misinterpreted in the fray. For broader, more strategic movements, the legions relied on a silent, unwavering language of sight, the standards. The most sacred was the aquila, the eagle, the soul of the entire legion. But almost as crucial for daily command were the signa, the ornate standards of each individual century. These were not simple flags. They were complex poles topped with a hand symbol, adorned with medallions representing past honors, and often bearing a unique emblem. In the dust and confusion of battle, a soldier's world shrank to the man beside him and the signum of his century. Where that standard went, he followed without question. The signifer, the standard bearer, was thus one of the most critical and courageous men in the unit. He was not just carrying a symbol, he was a living beacon, a mobile point of reference around which the entire century rallied and maneuvered. If the standard fell or wavered, it could spell disaster, as the men would lose their focal point and their sense of collective purpose. The general, watching from his elevated command post, exerted his control over this vast machine through these very standards and the dedicated signalers standing beside him. He would observe the flow of the battle, identify a weak point or an opportunity, and then issue an order. His signalers, using large, brightly colored cloths attached to spears, would then send a coded message across the field. They might wave a red flag in a specific pattern, or hold two flags in a cross formation. This visual telegraph was aimed at the commanding tribunes, or the lead signifers of the major units. Those officers, seeing the signal, would then physically tilt their unit's standard in the direction of the intended movement, perhaps toward a faltering enemy flank, or to reinforce a struggling allied cohort. The soldiers, seeing their own standard tilt, would immediately understand the new direction of advance and adjust their push accordingly. It was a chain of visual command that could redirect the effort of 5,000 men in a matter of moments, all without a single word being spoken. For the most complex and nuanced orders, however, even flags were insufficient. This is where the runners came in, the unsung heroes of Roman battlefield communication. These were not lowly messengers, but trusted, agile junior officers who knew the army's layout intimately. They would sprint from the command post, darting through the pre-planned gaps in the maniples, risking their lives to deliver a sealed tablet or a specific verbal command directly to a centurion. The message might be an order for a specific cohort to feign a retreat to lure the enemy into a trap, or instructions to prepare to form a cuneus wedge on the next horn blast. The survival of these runners was paramount to the general's plan, and their ability to navigate the chaotic, bloody landscape of the front lines was a testament to their training and bravery. This entire system, a seamless blend of auditory, visual, and direct communication, is what gave the Roman legion its legendary responsiveness, It wasn't just a collection of brave men. It was a single intelligent organism that could react, adapt, and strike with a speed and coordination that its opponents simply could not match. But all the intricate maneuvering and disciplined formations would mean little without a decisive first strike. And for the Roman legionary, that strike was delivered not with his sword, but with his javelin. The standard battlefield advance was a two-stage process of systematic dismantling. And it began with a weapon so ingeniously designed, it was as much a tool of psychological warfare as it was a missile. The pilum was a masterpiece of Roman military engineering, and its deployment was a calculated act meant to shatter the enemy's cohesion before a single gladius was ever drawn. As the legion advanced to within roughly 30 yards of the enemy line, a distance close enough to see the whites of their eyes, the order would ring out. The front rank of Hastoti would ready their pila. Each soldier carried 2 of these specialized javelins, and their design was deceptively simple yet brutally effective. The pilum featured a long, thin iron shank, often nearly 3 feet in length, topped with a small pyramidal tip, and mounted onto a heavy wooden shaft. The genius was in the soft, untempered iron used for the shank. This crucial detail was the key to its entire function. On the command, the first volley would be unleashed, a thick cloud of wood and iron arcing through the air before plunging down into the enemy ranks. The impact was devastating on multiple levels. The long iron shank and heavy weight gave the pilum tremendous penetrating power, capable of punching through an enemy's shield, and often continuing into the body of the man behind it. But the real chaos began a split second after impact. That soft iron shank was designed to bend upon striking a hard surface, like a shield board or the ground. This was not a design flaw. It was the entire point. A barbarian warrior who raised his shield to block the incoming volley would suddenly find his defense transformed into a crippling liability. A pilum slamming into his shield would often drive deep, its shank bending under the weight of the shaft. He now had a heavy 6-foot javelin dangling from his shield, making the shield unbalanced, unwieldy, and practically useless. His instinctive reaction, to try and pull the javelin out, would be futile, as the bent shank would act like a hook, locking it in place. In frustration and desperation, many warriors would be forced to discard their primary defense entirely, leaving them exposed for the Roman charge that was already beginning. Even if the pilum missed its target and hit the ground, the bent shank made it impossible for the enemy to pick up and throw back at the Romans, denying them a source of ammunition. The psychological effect of this volley cannot be overstated. Imagine standing in that opposing shield wall. You see the Romans advancing in their eerie, silent discipline. Then the air darkens with hundreds of these heavy javelins. The sound of their impact is a horrifying cacophony of splintering wood, screeching metal, and the screams of wounded men. All around you, comrades are stumbling, their shields now useless weights, or are pinned together by the same missile. The careful order of your own line begins to disintegrate into a scene of panic and confusion. And in that precise moment of maximum disarray, while you are still reeling from the shock, you hear a new sound from the Roman lines, the blare of horns and the unified roar of 10,000 men as they break into a full charge, gladii drawn, ready to exploit the chaos they have just engineered. The pilum volley was the critical first blow, a move that systematically disarmed and demoralized the enemy, turning a clash of 2 organized armies into a one-sided engagement before the real fight had even begun. The blare of the horn signaling the charge was the last sound many of the legion's foes would ever hear clearly. As the final pilum found its mark, the Roman line erupted into motion. This was not a wild, screaming rush like the charges of their Celtic or Germanic adversaries. It was a controlled, terrifying surge, a wall of scarlet tunics, and polished iron advancing at a steady, relentless jog. Their collective roar a deep-throated shout of ire. Ire meant to freeze the blood. The initial 30-yard gap closed in mere seconds, but in that brief window, the enemy's fate was already sealed. They were still reeling from the javelin storm, many now shieldless and disoriented, forced to face the most efficient killing machine the ancient world had ever devised. The moment of impact was not a dramatic crashing of two lines, but something far more sinister and systematic. The Roman front rank, their bodies braced behind the immense weight of their scutum shields, did not try to deliver a massive, shoving blow. Instead, they employed a technique known as the pulse, the push. Each man would angle his shoulder into the back of his scutum, his entire body weight driving forward, and punch the shield's central iron boss into the enemy before him. This was not about knocking the opponent over. It was about creating space and controlling the fight. The goal was to physically force the enemy's shield and weapons aside, or to drive him back a single, crucial step, disrupting his balance and his stance. In the tight press of the front rank, even a few inches of space was a lifetime. And in that fleeting window of opportunity, the gladius went to work. The legionary did not swing his sword in great, theatrical arcs. Such movements were impossible in the crush of bodies, and would leave him hopelessly exposed. The gladius was a tool of precision and economy. Its design short, double-edged, and with a long, tapered point was perfect for the brutal geometry of the scrum. The soldier would thrust, not slash. With his right arm, he would deliver a series of short, powerful stabbing motions from behind the cover of his shield, aiming for the stomach, the groin, or the thighs of the man opposite him. The point of the gladius was designed to punch through leather armor and between the ribs with horrifying ease. A deep thrust into the abdomen was almost always fatal, but agonizingly slow, causing the victim to collapse and create a stumbling block for the men behind him. The sheer repetition of this motion, push with the shield, stab with the sword, step forward, turned combat into a grim, industrial process. Each legionary was a craftsman, and his craft was death. This fighting style was the ultimate expression of Roman military philosophy. Collective action over individual heroics. A soldier was not dueling the man in front of him. He was part of a system. The man to his right was responsible for protecting his exposed flank with his own shield. The man behind him was applying forward pressure with his own scutum, pushing the entire rank inexorably onward, and ready to step into the front line the moment a comrade fell or grew too exhausted to continue. The centurion's voice could be heard over the din, not shouting encouragement, but barking commands: push, stab, advance, maintaining the rhythm of the killing machine. The enemy, often relying on individual prowess and long, slashing weapons, found themselves completely outmatched. Their swinging swords would clatter harmlessly off the Roman shield wall, or get caught in the press of bodies, while the relentless, mechanical punching of the gladius points never stopped. The advance was slow, grinding, and utterly demoralizing. For every enemy soldier who fell, the Roman line would take one more step forward, literally marching over the bodies of the dead and dying. The psychological effect of this relentless, impersonal pressure was often enough to break an enemy's will before their line physically broke. They were not fighting men. They were fighting a single, multi-limbed entity that seemed incapable of feeling fear or fatigue. This was the push of death, a phrase that perfectly captures its terrifying nature. It was a battle of inches, a suffocating, blood-soaked struggle where discipline and formation triumphed over brute strength and fury, turning the space between two armies into a slaughterhouse of Roman design. While the heavy infantry formed the unbreakable core of the legion, its true effectiveness was multiplied by the swift, hard-hitting force, operating on its edges the Roman cavalry. The equites. It's a common misconception to picture Roman horsemen as a primary shock force like the knights of the Middle Ages. Their role was far more nuanced and tactically sophisticated. They were the eyes, the shield, and the dagger of the army, specializing in missions where speed and mobility were more valuable than brute force. Their presence transformed the legion from a powerful but static hammer into a dynamic, all-encompassing instrument of war. Long before the main army even broke camp, the cavalry was already at work. Mounted scouts, often recruited from allied tribes renowned for their horsemanship, would fan out miles ahead of the marching column. Riding light and fast, these explorators were the general's remote sensors, mapping the route, identifying river crossings, and most critically, searching for any sign of the enemy. They looked for fresh tracks, disturbed vegetation, distant dust clouds, or the glint of sunlight on metal. A single report from a scout could warn of an ambush in a wooded pass, or reveal the disposition of an enemy force camped on a distant plain, allowing the general to plan his approach and deployment with a crucial informational advantage. This reconnaissance role was utterly vital. Without it, the entire legion, for all its discipline, was a blind giant stumbling through hostile territory. Once the army deployed for battle, the cavalry's position was always on the flanks. This was not a place of lesser importance. It was the most vulnerable part of the entire formation. The beautiful, complex layers of the triple acies were designed to meet a threat head-on. Its greatest weakness was an attack from the side or rear. A successful enemy cavalry charge, hitting the flank of a maniple, could roll up the entire Roman line from the side, causing catastrophic confusion and collapse. The Roman equites were the dedicated guardians against this nightmare scenario. They would form up on either end of the infantry line, creating a protective screen of horsemen and light infantry. Their job was to neutralize their opposite numbers, the enemy cavalry. This often resulted in swirling, chaotic skirmishes on the wings, separate from the main infantry clash. By engaging and pinning down the enemy's horsemen, the Roman cavalry ensured the legions could fight their battle without fear of a devastating blow from an unexpected direction. They were the guardians of the gate, ensuring the intricate infantry machine could operate without interruption. However, the cavalry's most psychologically terrifying, and ultimately decisive, role began the moment the enemy's will broke. Seeing an enemy army turn and run might seem like the end of a battle, but for the Romans, it was the beginning of a new, deadlier phase. A routed enemy who escapes to fight another day is a problem unresolved. The goal of Roman warfare was not just to win the field, but to annihilate the enemy's ability to ever wage war again. This is where the equites transformed from protectors into predators. As the enemy line fractured and men dropped their weapons to flee, the Roman infantry would halt their advance. They were exhausted, heavily armored, and in no condition to run down a scattering foe. Instead, the horns would sound a new command, and the cavalry would swing into their final, brutal mission: pursuit. Unencumbered by heavy armor and mounted on swift horses, the equites would launch themselves after the fleeing enemy. This was not a battle, it was a slaughter. A running man with his back turned and his shield discarded is utterly defenseless. The cavalrymen could ride him down with ease, using their longer spatha swords or thrusting spears to cut down fugitives from behind. The purpose was twofold: to maximize enemy casualties and, just as importantly, to shatter their morale completely. The message was unmistakable. Defeat by Rome was not just a setback, it was total, unforgiving annihilation. The stories told by the few survivors of such a rout would echo through the tribes for generations, serving as a powerful deterrent against future rebellion. A victory achieved by the infantry was solidified, and made permanent by the ruthless efficiency of the cavalry. They were the final, chilling instrument of Roman policy, turning a tactical victory on the field into a strategic masterpiece that secured entire regions for decades to come. Yet for all its layered complexity, the mighty legion was never designed to fight alone. Its true strength lay not just in the citizen soldiers at its core, but in the diverse array of specialists who marched and fought alongside them, the auxilia. The Roman military machine was a combined arms force centuries ahead of its time. And it was the non-citizen auxiliaries who provided the essential capabilities that the heavy infantry legions simply could not. While the legionaries were the anvil, the auxiliaries were the hammer, the scalpel, and the watchful eyes, transforming the Roman army from a powerful blunt instrument into a versatile, all-terrain, all-weather military system. The very concept of the auxilia was a stroke of pragmatic genius. Conquered peoples, from Gaul to Thrace to Syria, were not simply subjugated and taxed. They were integrated into the very machine that had defeated them. These auxiliary troops were recruited from across the empire, offering non-citizens a path to eventual Roman citizenship and land after 25 years of service. This policy accomplished two incredible feats at once. It neutralized potential rebel factions by giving their fiercest young warriors a stake in the system. And it gave Rome access to a breathtaking range of native martial traditions and specialized skills that its own Italian recruits did not possess. The Romans were brilliant at recognizing a good thing when they saw it. And if the Balearic Islanders were the best slingers in the world, why not pay them to be slingers for Rome? This strategic outsourcing gave the Roman army a truly global reach. From the arid hills of Crete came legendary archers, whose long-range composite bows could rain down arrows with terrifying accuracy, softening enemy formations before the legions ever advanced. These Cretan archers were often deployed as skirmishers or placed on high ground, their arrows capable of piercing light armor and picking off enemy leaders from a distance that must have seemed like sorcery. From the Balearic Islands, now modern-day Majorca and Minorca, came the slingers, trained from childhood with a simple leather strap and a lead or stone bullet. Balearic slingers were said to be able to hit a target with pinpoint precision. Their projectiles, sometimes engraved with mocking messages or the name of their unit, could travel even farther than an arrow and hit with the concussive force of a modern-day bullet. Deployed in front of or on the flanks of the legion, they would unleash a whirlwind of shot that could break bones, smash helmets, and demoralize an enemy long before the pilum volley even began. But perhaps the most crucial auxiliary role was filled by the cavalry. The early Roman citizen cavalry had never been particularly effective, but the need for a powerful, mobile wing was undeniable. This gap was filled by allied nations renowned for their horsemanship. From the wide plains of North Africa, Rome recruited the Numidians, who rode small, agile horses without saddles or bridles, guiding them with knees and voice. They were masters of the feigned retreat, able to unleash a cloud of javelins while swirling around a slower, heavier enemy force, harassing them to distraction. From the forests of Germania came tribesmen whose sheer size and power on horseback could deliver a devastating shock charge. And from the east, later in the empire, came heavily armored cataphracts, riders and horses both encased in scale armor, acting as near invulnerable tanks on the battlefield. These auxiliary cavalry units were the eyes and the fists of the army, scouting ahead, protecting the vulnerable flanks of the legions on the march, and delivering the crushing blow that turned an enemy retreat into a rout. Beyond these famous specialists, the auxilia also provided the bulk of Rome's standard light infantry and garrison troops. Units of Gallic or Germanic infantry, armed in their native style but organized and disciplined along Roman lines, would guard frontiers, man isolated forts, and serve as flexible rapid response forces. This freed the precious legions, the empire's most valuable and expensive assets, to concentrate as strategic reserves and campaign armies, ready to march to any major conflict. The system was a masterpiece of military and social engineering. It allowed Rome to project power on a global scale, leveraging the unique strengths of every culture it absorbed, all while binding those same cultures more tightly to the imperial project. The legionary in his gleaming lorica segmentata may have been the iconic symbol of Roman power, but it was the Balearic slinger, the Cretan archer, and the Germanic cavalryman who gave that power its reach, its flexibility, and its devastating, all-encompassing force. While the standard testudo provided a mobile roof against plunging fire, its true masterpiece was the specialized siege testudo, a formation engineered for one terrifying purpose: to deliver men right up to the enemy's wall. The core principle was the same: interlocking shields for all-around protection, but the scale, structure, and sheer audacity of its application were on another level entirely. Imagine not just a small box of men, but a vast, multi-layered carpet of shields, inching its way across the killing ground between the Roman lines and the fortified stone walls of a defiant city. This was the legion's answer to the ultimate defensive stronghold, and it turned the open ground, usually a death trap for attackers, into a protected pathway. The formation of a siege testudo was a logistical marvel, requiring the coordination of an entire century or even multiple units. The first rank of soldiers would form the front wall of the tortoise, their large scuta planted firmly on the ground, forming a solid barrier. The men behind them did not hold their shields in front. Instead, they raised them overhead, holding them flat and horizontal to form the roof. But the critical difference from the field testudo was the men in the subsequent ranks. They too raised their shields overhead, but they also pressed forward, their shields overlapping those of the men in front of them. This created a steeply sloping roof that started at the ground and angled upward. The shields were not just held for balance. Men in the middle and rear ranks would often brace themselves, bearing the considerable weight of the soldiers climbing above them. This was no longer just a formation. It was becoming a structure, and that structure had a single, shocking goal: to create a human siege ramp. As the massive shield tortoise pressed right up against the base of the enemy's wall, the order would be given. Soldiers from the rear ranks, often the most agile and lightly armed, would begin to climb. Using the interlocked shields of their comrades as footholds and handholds, they would scramble up the sloped roof of the testudo. The men below would brace with every ounce of their strength, their bodies becoming the foundation of this living ladder. The climbers would reach the top of the shield slope, now level with the top of the enemy's ramparts, and leap onto the wall itself, engaging the defenders in close combat to establish a precarious foothold. In the most daring assaults, if the wall was low enough, the entire testudo could function as a ramp, allowing a stream of soldiers to pour directly onto the battlements from a single protected point. The psychological impact on the defenders must have been sheer horror. They were accustomed to raining down death on attackers, scrambling up ladders, or huddled at the base of their walls. But this was different. They were facing a slow, methodical, and seemingly invulnerable machine that was not just surviving their missiles, but was physically building itself into a bridge to their doorstep. No amount of arrows or stones seemed to stop its advance. The relentless, silent progress of the siege testudo was a demoralizing demonstration of Roman discipline and ingenuity, proving that no wall, however high, was safe from the relentless will of the legions. Yet even the army on the move, that magnificent and sprawling agmen, was at its most vulnerable when strung out along a narrow road or trapped in a confined valley. Its length was its greatest weakness, a fact enemy commanders knew all too well. An ambush from the wooded high ground could strike the column's flank, slicing the snake into isolated, panicking segments that could be destroyed piecemeal. For this precise nightmare scenario, the Romans had a pre-drilled, breathtakingly complex solution that transformed a vulnerable line into an instant fortress: the agmen quadratum, or hollow square. This was not merely a defensive posture. It was the entire army reconfiguring itself into a mobile, all-directional stronghold. A testament to logistical planning so advanced it borders on the miraculous. The command to form the hollow square would ripple through the column with an urgency that every veteran understood. This was not a routine maneuver. It was a response to imminent, multi-directional threat. What followed was an orchestrated ballet of movement that had to be executed with flawless precision under extreme pressure. The vanguard, the army's spearhead, would halt and quickly wheel to form the forward-facing wall of the square. Simultaneously, the legions marching in the center of the column would split the units on the left, pivoting to form the left side, and those on the right forming the right side. The rearguard, the men who had been watching the army's back, would now advance rapidly to close the formation, becoming the fourth and final wall. In a matter of minutes, the entire force would contract from a miles-long line into a large, rectangular box of shields and spears. Inside this newly formed fortress was everything the army could not afford to lose: the baggage train with its siege engines and paid chests, the mules carrying the vital food and tools, the engineers, the medics, and the army's high command. These non-combatants and vital assets were now encased within a protective shell of some of the most disciplined infantry in history. Each side of the square was a fully formed battle line, with Hastoti and Principes in their maniples, Pila at the ready, their scuta interlocked. The sight this presented to an ambushing force must have been utterly demoralizing. Instead of striking a chaotic, exposed flank, they emerged from the trees to find a prepared, silent, and impenetrable wall already facing them, its defiance palpable. The true genius of the agmen quadratum was that it was not static. The entire formation could continue to move, like a gigantic, armored pillbug, slowly advancing along the road towards safety. It could march while maintaining its defensive integrity, fighting a continuous battle on all four sides if necessary. Any enemy group that charged would be met with a volley of pila and a wall of gladii. The formation eliminated the possibility of a rout, channeling the army's fear into a structured, collective resolve. It was the ultimate expression of the Roman military ethos. There is no problem, not even simultaneous attack from every direction, that cannot be solved with impeccable organization, drilled discipline, and an unbreakable will to protect the community of the army. The hollow square was the legion's way of declaring that even in the deepest ambush, it would never be a victim. It would always be a fortress. But all this intricate military engineering, this layered defense and disciplined maneuver, could be rendered useless in the face of a commander who understood its principles better than the Romans themselves. Such a man was Hannibal Barca, and his masterwork at Cannae in 216 B.C. stands as the ultimate lesson in how to dismantle a superior force, not by meeting its strength, but by inviting it to destroy itself. The Roman army that marched into southeastern Italy, that summer was the largest they had ever fielded, a staggering 86,000 men. A testament to their unwavering faith in the relentless power of their legions and their manipular system. They were confident, almost arrogantly so, that their numerical advantage and their tried and tested formations would simply overwhelm the Carthaginian force of roughly 50,000. What they did not understand was that Hannibal was not planning to break their formation. He was planning to use it as a weapon against them. Hannibal's genius lay in his deep understanding of the Roman military psyche. He knew they were drilled to advance, to push, to exert constant forward pressure. He knew their greatest tactical virtue, their disciplined aggression, could also become their greatest vulnerability if it was channeled into a trap. To that end, he deployed his army in a formation that seemed bizarre and almost amateurish to the Roman commanders. Instead of a straight line or a standard depth, he arranged his infantry center, comprised of his Gallic and Iberian allies, in a wide, convex bulge pointing toward the Roman. This was not a strong line, it was deliberately weak and shallow. On either end of this bulging center, he placed his best infantry, his African veterans, armed with captured Roman weapons. These troops were positioned in dense, deep columns, hidden slightly behind the main line. Finally, on the far flanks, his legendary Numidian and Gallic cavalry completed the setup. To the Romans, it looked like Hannibal had placed his weakest troops right where the full force of the Roman advance would hit. It was an invitation to a knockout blow, and the Romans, true to their nature, accepted it eagerly. The battle began as expected, with the massive Roman legions advancing in their classic triple acies formation. Their front line of Haestoti crashed into Hannibal's bulging center, and just as planned, the Carthaginian line began to yield. But this was not a rout, it was a controlled, fighting withdrawal. The Gallic and Iberian warriors gave ground slowly, step by step, all the while maintaining contact and drawing the Romans deeper into the pocket. The Roman commanders, sensing victory, poured more and more men into the center, urging the Principes and even the Triarii forward to press the advantage. The legion's very structure, designed to feed fresh troops into the fight, now worked perfectly to pack them into a suffocating mass. The beautiful, flexible checkerboard of the quincunx collapsed under the sheer weight of numbers and the compulsion to push forward. The Roman formation lost all its maneuverability, condensing into a giant, dense, and virtually stationary crowd of soldiers. While this deliberate implosion was happening in the center, Hannibal's cavalry executed the battle's decisive maneuver on the flanks. His heavy Gallic cavalry on the left utterly routed the smaller Roman cavalry force opposite them. Instead of pursuing the fleeing Romans, they immediately wheeled around behind the entire Roman army. Simultaneously, his Numidian cavalry on the right flank had pinned down and dispersed the allied Italian cavalry. The two victorious Carthaginian cavalry wings then linked up behind the Roman host, completely sealing off the battlefield. The Roman army was now surrounded, its lines of retreat cut off. This was the moment of horrific revelation. The Roman center, which thought it was winning, found itself in a nightmare. They had been drawn so far forward that Hannibal's originally convex line had now bent inward into a concave shape, with the Romans packed in the middle. At that exact moment, Hannibal gave the signal. His elite African infantry, who had been standing in reserve on the flanks, pivoted inward. They turned 90 degrees and advanced like two swinging doors, hitting the densely packed Roman flanks with tremendous force. In an instant, the Romans were completely encircled. They were attacked from the front by the now halted Carthaginian center, from both flanks by the African infantry, and from the rear by the cavalry. The very depth of the Roman formation, usually its greatest strength, became its curse. Men in the rear, hearing the screams from behind them and realizing they were surrounded, could not flee. Those in the front could not advance. They were pressed together so tightly that most could not even raise their arms to use their weapons. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic slaughter that lasted for hours. The Carthaginian forces methodically compressed the trapped Roman army, cutting down soldiers who had no room to defend themselves. Ancient sources, though likely exaggerated, claim 50 to 70,000 Romans and allies died that day. including the consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus and 80 senators. It was the worst defeat in Roman history, a catastrophic failure that demonstrated a brutal truth. No formation, however brilliant, is immune to a commander who can outthink it. The Romans learned at Cannae that discipline and pressure alone were not enough. They needed strategic subtlety and commanders who could adapt on the fly. The lessons of Cannae were written in the blood of a generation, and they would force the Romans to evolve from a blunt instrument into a more sophisticated and cunning military power, one that would eventually learn to defeat Hannibal at his own game. 14 years after the catastrophe at Cannae, the ghost of that defeat still loomed over Rome. The man who had orchestrated that masterpiece of annihilation, Hannibal Barca, was still on Italian soil, an undefeated nightmare that had haunted a generation. But in 202 BC, the stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation, not in Italy, but on the plains of North Africa, near a place called Zama. This time, however, the Romans were not led by a traditional aristocrat, bound by old doctrines. They were led by a commander who had studied Hannibal's own playbook, a brilliant innovator named Publius Cornelius Scipio, later to be known as Africanus. And at Zama, it was Scipio who would use the Roman legion's inherent flexibility, not just to match Hannibal's genius, but to surpass it, turning the manipular system into a surgical instrument of victory. Hannibal, forced to return to Africa to defend his homeland of Carthage, entered the field with a formidable but heterogeneous army. His greatest and most terrifying asset was his corps of 80 war elephants, beasts that functioned as the ancient world's tanks, capable of shredding the most disciplined infantry formations through pure, unadulterated terror. Alongside them, he had his corps of hardened, lifelong veterans from his Italian campaign, the very men who had stood with him at Cannae and Trebia, the most lethal infantry in the Mediterranean. Behind them were fresh but untested recruits from Carthage, and a large contingent of allied mercenaries whose loyalty was uncertain. Hannibal's plan was likely a refined version of his Cannae strategy. Use the elephants to blast chaotic holes in the Roman line, then send in his veterans to exploit the confusion and roll up the flanks. Scipio, however, was ready. He understood that the key to neutralizing the elephants lay in controlling their movement, not in stopping them head-on. As the Carthaginian line thundered forward, the ground shaking under the weight of the colossal animals, Scipio gave a series of pre-arranged commands. Instead of arranging his maniples in the standard quincunx checkerboard, he did something that must have looked bizarre to a traditionalist. He ordered the maniples of his hestoti, the front line, to form up not with gaps between them, but directly behind one another, creating long open channels that ran perpendicular to the enemy, like aisles in a theater leading straight back through his entire army. This was a breathtakingly clever gambit. As the elephants charged, they instinctively avoided the solid-looking blocks of soldiers, and instead were funneled directly into these inviting, empty lanes. The Roman velites, the light skirmishers, harassed the beasts with javelins and shouts, further guiding them into the traps. Once inside these corridors, the elephants found themselves channeled harmlessly through the Roman ranks. Soldiers on the sides of the lanes rained down javelins on the animals' vulnerable flanks, but the real masterstroke was the lack of a solid wall for them to crash into. The elephants, confused and wounded, mostly passed straight through the Roman formation without causing any significant disruption, some even panicking and stampeding back into their own Carthaginian line. In one brilliant, pre-planned maneuver, Scipio had utterly nullified Hannibal's most fearsome weapon. With the elephant charge a catastrophic failure for Carthage, the battle settled into the main infantry clash. Hannibal's first line, comprised of those mercenaries and new recruits, surged forward to meet Scipio's Hastati. The fighting was fierce, but the Roman professionals gradually gained the upper hand, their discipline and equipment proving superior. As this first Carthaginian line began to waver and break, they fell back but directly into the path of Hannibal's second line, his Carthaginian citizen militia. Hannibal, fearing a rout, had reportedly ordered his second line not to allow the first to retreat through them. What followed was a disastrous breakdown in the Carthaginian command structure. The second line, refusing to open ranks, began fighting their own fleeing mercenaries, while the advancing Romans pressed the attack. A brutal melee erupted within the Carthaginian ranks, creating a chaotic and bloody scrum that played directly into Roman hands. This was the moment Scipio had waited for. Instead of pushing his exhausted Hastati forward into this mess, he demonstrated the manipular system's perfect mechanics for maintaining fresh troops. He sounded the recall, pulling his front line back. Then he ordered his second line, the veteran Principes, to advance through the pre-planned intervals. They moved forward in perfect order, their lines dressed and their shields locked, forming a new, unbroken wall of fresh, determined soldiers. Simultaneously, he repositioned his third line, the Triarii, widening the maniples to extend the Roman line and prevent any flanking maneuver from the remaining Carthaginian cavalry. This flawless rotation under pressure meant that as the Carthaginian second line finally overcame the chaos of its own making, it wasn't met by a tired and disorganized Roman force. It was met by a completely fresh battle line, the Principes, at the peak of their strength and resolve. The final act pitted Scipio's consolidated and rested legions against Hannibal's last and best troops, his legendary veterans from Italy, who had been held in reserve. This was a clash of titans, the finest infantry of their age meeting head-on. The outcome hung in the balance until the Roman and Numidian cavalry, which had earlier chased off its Carthaginian counterparts, returned to the battlefield at the critical moment. They did not attack the rear of Hannibal's veterans directly, which would have been difficult against such a disciplined formation. Instead, they struck the Carthaginian rear in a series of furious charges, creating immense psychological pressure and pinning Hannibal's best troops in place. Trapped between the anvil of the relentless Roman infantry and the hammer of the cavalry at their backs, the Carthaginian veterans were systematically cut down. They fought to the last man, but the battle and the war was lost. At Zama, Scipio didn't win with a trick. He won by understanding the manipular system better than any Roman before him, using its inherent flexibility to absorb a shock, rotate his strength, and apply maximum pressure at the perfect time, finally defeating the one enemy Rome feared most. Yet for all its tactical brilliance on the battlefield, the manipular legion of the mid-Republic was a system intrinsically tied to the society that created it, a society that was cracking under the immense pressure of its own expansion. The very wars the maniples had won created an empire that the part-time citizen soldier farmer could no longer effectively defend. By the end of the 2nd century B.C., Rome's military model was in a state of quiet crisis. The traditional requirement for soldiers to own property meant the pool of eligible recruits was shrinking dramatically, as prolonged wars kept small farmers away from their land, leading to debt, bankruptcy, and the loss of their property, the very qualification that allowed them to serve. The army was caught in a devastating paradox. It needed more soldiers to garrison a sprawling empire, but the wars required to build that empire were systematically destroying the class of men who were legally allowed to become soldiers. This strategic deadlock was shattered by one of the most consequential figures in Roman history, Gaius Marius, a brilliant, ambitious, and gruff military man from a non-aristocratic family. Marius was elected consul in 107 B.C. amidst a dire military emergency in North Africa against the Numidian king Jugurtha. Faced with a critical shortage of traditional recruits, Marius took a step that conservative senators viewed as revolutionary and dangerous. He explicitly opened legionary recruitment to the Capite censi, the head count, the landless poorest citizens who had previously been excluded from military service. This was not merely an administrative change, it was a social earthquake. It transformed the Roman army from a militia of citizen farmers who fought for the state, and then returned to their plows, into a professional force of career soldiers who enlisted for pay, loot, and the promise of a land grant upon retirement. Their loyalty began to shift subtly from the abstract idea of the Republic to the general who recruited them, paid them, and could secure their future. This single change created a new dynamic of client armies that would ultimately fuel the civil wars of the late Republic. To equip and standardize this new professional force, Marius introduced sweeping changes to their kit, most famously the Marian mule. He made the legionary responsible for carrying his own load weapons, rations, a cooking pot, a stake for the palisade, and other essentials, all suspended from a forked pole carried over the shoulder. This eliminated the slow, cumbersome baggage train that had traditionally followed the legions, dramatically increasing their strategic mobility and allowing them to march faster and farther than any enemy expected. Standardization reached its peak, with every piece of equipment now mass-produced by the state. Marius is also credited with making the Silver Eagle, the Aquila, the sole and sacred standard of the entire legion, a powerful symbol of the new, centralized unit cohesion he sought to foster. The most decisive tactical innovation, however, was the formal abolition of the maniple and the tripartite lines of Haestoti, Principes, and Triarii. In their place, Marius instituted the cohort as the primary tactical unit of the legion. A cohort was not simply a larger maniple. It was a fundamental reorganization, where a maniple was a specialized unit of 120 men of the same class and experience. A cohort was a mixed unit of approximately 480 men. It contained within it the equivalent of a maniple of Haestoti, a maniple of Principes, and a maniple of Triarii, all rolled into one. This meant that each individual cohort was a miniature legion, a self-contained, combined arms unit that possessed its own veterans, its own young fighters, and its own skirmishing capabilities. A full legion now consisted of 10 of these identical cohorts, each commanded by a senior centurion. The strategic advantages of the cohortal legion were immediately apparent. It was a far more flexible and robust system for the kind of warfare Rome was now conducting. The checkerboard quincunx formation could still be used, but now with 10 large, powerful blocks instead of 30 smaller, more fragile ones. This made the battle line more solid and less prone to being punched through by a determined enemy charge. Each cohort, with its own internal depth and mix of experience, could operate semi-independently, making the legion perfect for the garrison and pacification duties required across the empire. A single cohort could be sent to guard a mountain pass or a river crossing, confident that it had the internal strength and leadership to handle a threat on its own. Furthermore, the command structure was vastly simplified. Instead of a general having to coordinate the movements of 30 separate maniples, he now directed 10 cohorts. This allowed for clearer, faster orders and more responsive control on a chaotic battlefield. The Battle of Aquae Sextiae in 102 B.C. demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Marius's new model army. Facing a massive migrating horde of Germanic Teutones, Marius used the discipline and mobility of his professional cohorts to choose the ground. He positioned his army on a hill, and when the Teutones launched a disordered, furious assault uphill, the Roman cohorts held their ground. Then a hidden force of 3,000 Roman troops that Marius had placed in ambush launched a surprise attack on the enemy's rear. The Teutonic horde, trapped between the main Roman line and the ambush, was annihilated. The cohort, a large, sturdy, and independently powerful unit, had proven it could withstand the shock of a barbarian charge and execute complex tactics with perfect discipline. The era of the maniple was over. The age of the professional legionary, organized in the cohort, had begun, an institution so effective it would become the backbone of the imperial army that secured the Pax Romana for centuries to come. The Marian reforms did more than just change who could join the army. They fundamentally redesigned its entire tactical architecture. Out went the intricate, three-layered checkerboard of the manipular legion, with its specialized classes of Hastoti, Principes, and Triarii. In its place, Gaius Marius instituted a new, more robust, and brutally efficient building block: the cohort. This was not merely a renaming of units. It was a complete philosophical shift in how the Roman army was meant to fight, and more importantly, to conquer and hold a vast empire. A single Marian cohort was a powerful, self-contained unit of war. Where the old maniple had been a specialized group of 120 men of the same age and experience, the new cohort was a mixed unit of roughly 480 men. Think of it as a miniature legion all its own. Within its ranks, it contained the equivalent of a maniple of frontline fighters, a maniple of steady veterans, and a maniple of hardened reserves, all merged into one cohesive force. This meant that every single cohort possessed its own internal depth, its own veteran leadership, and its own organic ability to handle a wide range of combat situations without needing constant support from neighboring units. A full legion was now composed of 10 of these identical, powerful cohorts, each commanded by a senior centurion whose authority was absolute. This new structure fundamentally altered how the legion deployed for battle. The classic manipular quincunx, with its inviting gaps and fluid channels for rotation, was largely replaced by a more straightforward, but far more solid, battle line. Instead of 30 smaller, more vulnerable maniples arranged in a checkerboard, the general now had 10 large, heavy blocks to position. These cohort blocks could still be arranged with intervals between them for a degree of maneuverability, but the overall impression was one of overwhelming solidity and weight. The front was broader and more unbroken, presenting a much more daunting obstacle to an enemy charge. This was a formation designed less for intricate battlefield maneuver against a peer opponent like Hannibal, and more for the relentless, grinding advance that would overwhelm the disparate tribal armies Rome now faced on the frontiers of its expanding empire. The tactical advantages of the cohort system were perfectly suited for the new professional army's mission. First and foremost was its incredible flexibility for garrison and pacification duties. The vast Roman Empire couldn't afford to deploy entire legions to every trouble spot. Now a single cohort, as a complete fighting unit in its own right, could be sent to guard a strategic mountain pass, patrol a river border, or garrison a rebellious town. This cohort had its own command structure, its own veterans to maintain discipline, and enough manpower to hold its own against most threats it would encounter. This allowed Rome to project power and maintain control over a huge geographical area with astonishing efficiency. In a major pitched battle, the cohort's larger size and internal mix of experience made it incredibly resilient. It was far harder for a raging barbarian charge to break apart a solid block of 480 men than it was to punch through a thinner line of 120. The cohort could absorb a tremendous amount of shock and pressure without collapsing. Furthermore, command and control were vastly simplified. A general now only had to coordinate the movements of 10 large units instead of 30 smaller ones. This made the army more responsive on the battlefield. Orders could be relayed faster and executed more cohesively. A general could order an entire cohort to wheel left and reinforce a weakening section of the line, and it would move as a single, powerful entity. The shift from the manipular system to the cohort legion reflects a broader change in Roman strategic goals. The manipular legion was a brilliant tool for winning set-piece battles on the Italian peninsula against other organized states. Its flexibility was its defense. The cohort legion, by contrast, was the perfect instrument of imperial expansion and control. Its strength and simplicity were its offense. It was a blunt, powerful hammer designed to break tribal warbands, storm hilltop fortresses, and then stand firm as an army of occupation. It turned the legion from a force that excelled at winning wars of maneuver into a force that was unparalleled at waging wars of conquest and consolidation. This new model, born of necessity under Marius, would become the enduring backbone of the imperial army, the engine that secured and policed the Roman peace for centuries to come. This obsessive focus on organization, on breaking down a large force into smaller, interchangeable modules, is perhaps Rome's greatest gift to the art of war. The cohort itself was the ultimate modular unit, a standardized block of manpower that could be slotted into a battle line, detached for independent garrison duty, or combined with other cohorts for a specific task. This principle of creating flexible, semi-autonomous units that can operate alone or as part of a greater whole is the bedrock of nearly every modern army's structure. Look at a contemporary military organization chart, and you will see the ghost of the legion. A Roman century of 80 men finds its direct descendant in the modern army company, a unit of a similar size and function, led by a captain whose role echoes that of the centurion. The cohort, at roughly 480 men, is the clear precursor to the battalion, the fundamental building block for maneuver in today's forces. This isn't a coincidence. It is the result of centuries of military evolution that repeatedly rediscovered the timeless utility of the Roman model. The ability to task organize to break apart and reassemble these units like Lego bricks to meet a specific tactical need is a direct inheritance from the legion's ability to form a testudo one moment and a quincunx the next, all based on the same core components of disciplined soldiers. That discipline, drilled into the bone through relentless repetition, is another cornerstone of the Roman legacy that echoes on every parade square and training ground in the world. The Roman genius was understanding that courage is fleeting, but muscle memory is permanent. They institutionalized the process of turning individuals into components of a machine. The modern concept of train how you fight is a Roman invention. The endless marching at full pack, the weapon drills against posts, the precise rehearsals of formation changes, all of this was designed to make the correct action in battle an automatic reaction, bypassing the paralysis of fear. Today, soldiers across the globe spend countless hours on rifle ranges, practicing immediate action drills for weapon malfunctions, and rehearsing squad and platoon battle drills until they can perform them in their sleep. This is the modern equivalent of the Roman armor cogant, the arms drill. The goal is identical: to forge a unit that moves as one, responds to commands instantly, and maintains cohesion under the unimaginable stress of combat. The centurion's vine staff has been replaced by a drill instructor's voice, but the purpose is the same: to instill unthinking obedience and flawless execution through relentless, often brutal, preparation. Perhaps the most profound and often overlooked Roman innovation was their approach to the battlefield itself. They did not simply fight on the land, they sought to dominate and reshape it to their advantage through what we now call field engineering. A Roman army on the march was a mobile factory of fortification, Every single night, no matter how exhausted the troops or how secure the location seemed, they constructed a fortified camp, a castrum, following an exact same blueprint. This wasn't just for defense. It was a psychological statement of permanence and control. It meant the Roman army always operated from a position of strength, always had a secure supply depot and a fallback point. This mentality of altering the terrain is fundamental to modern combined arms warfare. The elaborate trench systems of World War I, the rapid construction of forward operating bases in modern counterinsurgency operations, the use of combat engineers to breach obstacles and clear routes, all of these are extensions of the Roman principle that the environment is not a fixed condition, but a variable to be engineered in your favor. The legionary's entrenching tool was as vital as his gladius, and today, every soldier is still taught to dig, because controlling the ground is the first step to controlling the fight. We can trace a direct line from the Roman eagle to the standards carried by regiments today. Symbols of unit, pride, and identity that soldiers will die to protect. The system of visual and auditory signals, the flags and horns of the legions, evolved into the complex radio protocols and visual signals used by modern infantry to coordinate movements while maintaining noise discipline. Even the tactical concepts endure. The Roman idea of a defense in depth, using multiple layered lines to absorb and break an enemy attack, is the principle behind modern defensive positions that use mutually supporting strongpoints and fallback lines. The hammer and anvil tactic, perfected by Scipio at Zoma, using his cavalry to strike the rear of an enemy pinned by his infantry, remains a classic maneuver taught in military academies. The Romans created a comprehensive system of war that integrated technology, discipline, organization, and engineering into a seamless whole. They proved that an army's greatest weapon is not its sword, but its structure, not its individual heroes, but its collective mind. Their formations were not just arrangements of men. They were the physical expression of a revolutionary military philosophy, one that understood that order, imposed by will and drill, is the ultimate weapon against the chaos of the battlefield. This philosophy, etched into the very DNA of Western military thought, continues to guide the movement of armies to this day. From the flexible checkerboard of the manipular legion to the living fortress of the testudo, and from the aggressive spearhead of the wedge to the desperate, defiant circle of the orb, the Roman legion's true power was never in its swords or its spears, but in its profound understanding of human psychology and mass movement. Each formation was a calculated solution to a specific battlefield problem, a masterpiece of military engineering designed to turn raw courage into controlled, industrial efficiency. The triple acies with its rotating lines broke the enemy's will through relentless freshness. The quincunx checkerboard turned apparent weakness into a devastating trap. The testudo demonstrated that perfect unity could provide near total invulnerability. And the cohort system showed how standardization and modular design could build an empire. What cemented Rome's dominance for centuries was not any single tactic, but the underlying principles that made them all possible. An unbreakable discipline drilled into every soldier until it became second nature. A flexibility of mind that allowed them to adapt and evolve from crushing defeats. And a culture of innovation that constantly sought a better way to organize men and metal for war. They understood that the ultimate weapon is not a piece of technology, but a system that leverages order, training, and collective action to overcome the chaos of combat. This intellectual approach to warfare, this belief that any challenge could be met with the right application of organized thought and will, is their most enduring legacy. So we turn it over to you. After this march through the legions, most brilliant tactical inventions? Which formation stands out to you as the most impressive? Was it the sheer defensive genius of the testudo, a moving fortress that defied arrows and stones, or the surgical precision of the quincunx wedge, designed to shatter an enemy line from within? Perhaps it was the deceptive simplicity of the triple line's rotation, a system of sustained pressure that no other army could match. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient military history, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more journeys back into the mysteries of the past. Until next time,